Well, once again, we're looking forward to a lively and important speech. Um, One of the things that I learned when I came to the Massachusetts Historical Society was that this is a great place to be because you have so many colleagues. Look around. This is the Great American Center for Higher Education. If you're working at the MHS, you can work with people from Harvard and from MIT and BU and BC and Wellesley and Tufts and Brandeis and on and on and on. It means that it's a very rich experience. And in the 3 decades that I've been here, I've really appreciated that. Case in point, Brendan McConville. Brendan, since he got here from SUNY Binghamton roughly a decade ago, has been a stalwart here. He's been involved in our Early American Seminar, involved in this particular program. He's done research here, which is something that we really like to see. He sends his graduate students here. This is something that we welcome as well. Brendan is a graduate of Reed College. He did his PhD at Brown, author of several important books, most recently, King's Three Faces. So it's a particular pleasure to invite to the podium the collegial Brendan McConville.
Well, that was quite a nice introduction. And before I begin, I did want to first thank MHS, the David Library of the American Revolution, BU, my home institution, of course, and Williams College for supporting the program today, this weekend. They've all been fabulous sponsors. They really do make it happen for all of us, and it really has been a pleasure to work with them and sort of been hassle-free. I also, before I begin, I do want to say that last night before I went to sleep, or as I dozed off, I started to have a dream. And in the dream, there was my name was in a column on the side of a big screen, and then it floated to the middle of the screen and disappeared. It really was something. I also want to thank the organizing committee for giving me a chance to speak. Of course, I was a member of the committee, and that says volumes really about how I arrived here this evening. Conrad, despite his lovely introduction, of course, when he sort of green-lighted this, immediately started to think, well, maybe not, And he said to me, you've got to speak slowly. You can't go off on one of your crazy things. Focus on only one or two things. Keep it modest, keep it brief, and perhaps use a handout. The good news is I took the part about keeping it brief to heart. In regard to the rest, consult your handouts. I would also add that in giving a talk that argues for a revitalization and a recentering of the study of the American Revolution, especially its politics writ large, to this particular audience, I realize I'm preaching to the converted, at least to some degree. Personally, I've always thought and believed that leads to a successful sermon. So with that, those things said, I would begin tonight by simply saying the title of the talk is The Great Cycle, the Professional Study of the American Revolution, 1960 to 2015. The people who worked first on the Philadelphia Conference 3 years ago, and this conference, which I would describe this conference as the cousin of the Philadelphia Conference rather than the child of it, have been motivated by a widely held and I think correct perception that the professional study of the American Revolution, especially the period's politics, has dramatically waned over the last 25 years, drifting into some serious doldrums. I would say, at least for me, that John Murren's self-immolation talk, which he gave at the beginning of this century in several places, first here on a little panel with myself, Woody, and the late Pauline Mayer, that talk probably sparked all this in a way. He was the first person to really start to interpret the meaning of the decline of the revolutionary historiography after 1990. There have been some fine professional studies in the last 10 years or so, and some concentrated scholarship, particularly of the constitutional crisis in the early national period, and some excellent founder biographies by professional writers. But the revolution, which had been so important to previous scholarly generations, has clearly lost its central hold on the field, and discussion has shifted into other areas far afield from the overtly political and away from this chronology. Quite honestly, it's this lack of scholarship that convinced us have worked on the two conferences of the need for this reconsideration. Personally, I have also believed that the lack of work on the revolution has weakened the field as a whole, it's weakened its underlying conceptual and intellectual structure, and altered the relationship of the professional study of American history to the rest of American society, to the detriment of both. And more importantly, I think we have reached a point not unlike that scholars found themselves in the early 1960s, at a moment when technology, the structure of universities and history departments, and the society as a whole invites or demands a re-engagement with the American Revolution, its origins, its character, and its consequences. This evening, I want to briefly examine how we got to where we are right now, and I want to examine the changes I believe give a renewed urgency to the study of the Revolution. We are at a point where we need to reconsider the revolution and how we study the revolution. Laying down aspects of the frameworks that have guided study in the field for the last 50 years or so will allow us, I think, to rethink the period and demonstrates that even what seems familiar and long settled in regard to the revolution are still vibrantly alive as historical problems. To consider briefly the decline of the study of the American Revolution, I think we need to return to the time when the study of the Revolution detached from the WASP ascendancy to the time of really Carolyn Robbins, who I would date it to initially, to the beginning of the study of political idioms in the Anglo-American world. About 50 years ago, a group of early American historians, most of them at the beginning of their careers, began to break with the field's received wisdoms in regard to the period's political and intellectual history, particularly concerning the Revolution. This group, which ultimately numbered between 20 and 30 scholars, went on to do the work that defined the political history in the field for the next 3 decades or 4 decades, and indeed in other areas of early American history as well, since they didn't necessarily exclusively work on the Revolution. In a sense, much of this remains in place today, as the vast drought in historical writing about the Revolution has left it in place. This great burst of scholarship that began in the 1960s, early 1960s, it originated, I think, in an important technological shift, the appearance of microfilm in libraries for carrying various early American imprints, linked to the first sustained use of sociological and anthropological methods, especially the concept of ideology and the related concept of paradigm shift, borrowed in an immediate sense from Thomas Kuhn. Scholars also deployed the work, of course, of Clifford Geertz, Peter Berger, Mary Douglas, Pitt Rivers, and others to examine, Julian Pitt Rivers and others to examine the 18th century. It was the first effort to do what we call now interdisciplinary history. I think also the great expansion of universities in that moment and the inclusion of more and different kinds of people into these new universities, enabled by the GI Bill, by defense fellowships, and the feminist movement, contributed to this burst of scholarship. And the Times, I think, themselves contributed to it, in first the civil rights movement, and then the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement, which seemed to demand a constant re-examination of the origins and character of fundamental American values. Eventually, again, as most of us know, debate emerged within this group, the parties often arguing with one another with a kind of mythical certainty over the revolution's origins and meanings. I won't go over the parameters of those debates. I mean, most of the people in the room have some sense of them. Those debates, though, ended in around 1990, really with the publishing, I think, of Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution, and, which gets mentioned less, and with the conference honoring George Bilius, which was held at the American Antiquarian Society in 1991, the papers from which they published in their proceedings. That was, I think, the last conference where that was organized on that principle of they're going to see the contending parties debate. Many of the people who participated in that have passed away. Several of them have passed away, the participants. The ones that leap to mind are John Diggins and Lance Banning to me, but I think several others as well. But that really marked the end in 1991. I really have a sense of that, just as I was finishing graduate school. To give you a brief, crude sense of just how serious this startling decline has been, in the period between 1990, when the debate over what Robert Chalhoub called the Republican synthesis ground to a halt, and to 2011, at the time of the planning of the Philadelphia Conference, the Journal of American History ran 435 articles. Again, these statistics are a little crude, and if I had, had time, I would have prepared a huge chart with, graphs and charts, but you'll get a sense of it. Of those 435 articles, 3 had the American Revolution or something similar in the title, and only 13 had subjects directly related to the revolutionary crisis as their main themes, although obviously other pieces spoke to aspects of the period. In that same period, the American Historical Review ran just 2 articles with the same parameters and 1 related piece out of a total of 403 articles. The William and Mary Quarterly, of course, ran more with 18 article titles directly referencing the Revolution and 28 more on related topics out of a total of 372. Early American Studies, which had appeared later, had only 3 titles dedicated to the Revolution, with 12 more related out of 181 articles. The Journal of the Early Republic, which is another journal, continued to publish some pieces, and in the last few years, a new journal, American Political Thought, which is really run by political scientists, political philosophers, has appeared and has carried pieces on the revolution, mostly in regard to high politics. But even as academic books continue to appear on personalities and subjects related to the revolution, and new forms of media online have expanded and encouraged discussion, as I think we all know, no clear lines of debate or interpretation or reinterpretation about the revolution have emerged really for what is now 25 years. I think it is especially telling for me because it exactly parallels my own career. The exact time of my own career, from that time in 1991 when I was finishing my dissertation until now, basically. Although some scholars, and by that I mean Jack Rakoff and some of his peers, believe that all the major problems of revolutionary research had been solved either by 1991 or certainly by the year 2000. Most scholars, I think, believe that it was a natural exhaustion after a long and often contentious debate or series of debates about the revolution's origins, its ideological character, and the constitutional crisis of 1787 and 88. The latter, which was conducted, as it still largely is, along Beardian lines. I do think that despite both the exhaustion issue and Professor Rakoff's claim that several other factors actually better explain the demise of this interest in the revolution around 1990. That debate became way too dependent on a narrow, readily available source base, and books began to be written about other people's books. Archival engagement in the group of scholars was never great. There was a kind of failure, I think, of archival research in that generation to a degree, and its failure both caused the debate to collapse and left the field as a whole with a distorted view of the period. I also think that the idea of paradigm shift that had driven so much of the scholarship in the years between 1960 and 1990 had become by that latter year and remain now a kind of deterministic straitjacket that had inhibited rather than encouraged scholarship. We are still stuck in this Kuhnian straitjacket to a degree, even those who profess to question it. Republicanization and democratization and the rise of capitalism have become so deterministic that all studies of change in the period, or many of them, came to either show how one or the other arose, or lament their failures and shortcomings or their nature, or lament the hypocrisy of those who gave birth to these systems. The decline of scholarship on the revolution, I think, also reflected a shift at that time in the early 1990s in the field's personnel. The field's personnel at that time began to be more and more people trained in programs whose early American faculty did not emphasize the revolution in their own research, and this is especially true of the people from Johns Hopkins and Yale. That is about half, at least, of the active scholars in the field. And at that time, when Jack Green was training people and John Demos, they were not focused on revolutionary scholarship. And if you look at it, sort of just take it out as statistically, that's how it looks. For these reasons, I think, joined also to a growing rhetoric of globalization and multiculturalism in the broader society, professional scholarship turned away from the revolutionary period, and what scholarship was written about the period's politics and ideology tended to focus on the early national period. Of course, a lot of this is quite good scholarship. Finally, I think it is worth noting that this particular line of scholarship died at precisely the same moment as the Cold War ended. The Cold War encased that debate and continually demanded a consideration of the nation's origins and values and identity. The imperative to study the revolution dissipated dramatically with its death. With the end of the Cold War, the logic that drove this scholarship, an element of it dissipated. Now, though, after 20 or 25 years, depending on how you want to count, in which the revolution has been decentered and focus has been on a very different early America, if such a thing still exists, and in a sense it has very much lost meaning to be supplanted by what I would call early Americas. Increasingly, the scholarship has focused on the history of ocean zones, continents, racial and social categories, networks, and transnational systems of organization, and the field has become, in the hands of academics, very intentionally in some hands, I think, less about the nation and what we would call the structure of understanding shaped by national events, and less, of course, about the older chronological and geographic boundaries that had been used. Some of the scholars working in this vein, in this later group, borrow from the older toolbox of interdisciplinary history formed in the 1960s, while others imported concepts from literature and post-colonial studies. But this scholarship in the last 25 years, I think, has reflected the contemporary cultural and economic rhetoric about globalization and about society, very directly in my mind, and very much, I think despite some of the radical academic rhetoric, the globalism portion of this change is in many ways in tune with the aims of corporate globalization. And what was early American political history has become about colonialisms and revolutions, or perhaps more accurately, it has become about the age of colonialisms and the age of revolutions, international interactions and international law, detached either overtly or subtly, consciously or unconsciously from the national narrative and the culturally specific. To give you a rough sense of this change, as I said earlier, the Journal of American History ran 435 articles between 1990 and 2011. As I said, 3 of them had the words American Revolution in their title in that period. 17 had the word Atlantic in the title, and 10 used empire as a kind of Atlantic metaphor. 10 had the words borderlands, 13 had the words consumption, 44 had race, 22 had slavery, gender was used 20 times, and sex 15 times. Think about that. Revolution, 3 times, sex 15 times. The William and Mary Quarterly published 43 articles with the word Atlantic or transatlantic, transnational, or transoceanic in the title in the same period. Slave was in 71 articles. Using gender was used 17 times, including in that manhood and masculinity, and sex and sexuality 14 times. Of course, we do need a kind of longer linear charting of this and what it all looks like, but you can see that some topics had outstripped the revolution as a focus of scholarship. And the titles in the journals reflect this, the major journals of the field. While this new scholarship has often self-consciously, and I think pointedly, rejected national narrative, and events and event chronology, and what has often been at times derided as the history of dead white men, most of the scholarship done in the last 25 years, I think, is very much about a very specific set of very specific national narratives and events, or series of events, and these events are very much dominated by dead white men. Much of the study of systems, of race and slavery, of environment and environmental change, of consumption and of oceanic zones, of colonialism rather than colonial America, really is about something very old-fashioned, about war and diplomacy. Specifically, it seems to me that much of this scholarship is shaped by the reality created by the long war between France and Great Britain that began in 1690 and did not end until Wellington beat Napoleon at Waterloo. Wrong beating. This Second Hundred Years' War, which has shaped the fate of much of the world in the 18th and 19th century and continues to, in a sense, until today. Indeed, it might be fair to say in a way that Napoleon's final triumph was over the field of early American history, and certainly that worked out better than the invasion of Russia. This war drove economies, altered trade, encouraged the expansion of the plantation complex, stressed natural environments, directly via battle and indirectly via the constant demand for food, wood, metal, and clothing for ever-expanding armies, navies, merchant fleets, and an ever-expanding population. Of course, some studies in the last 25 years have very much been about empire and post-colonialism, but I would suggest that most of the scholarship in its several threads is really about this long war, this Second Hundred Years' War, and about the massive demographic expansion of the European population and the related decline in other populations elsewhere that came with the war. In a strange sense, and this is why, after the Philadelphia Conference, I think the organizers and some participants were quite sort of dissatisfied or felt uneasy. It's because the Philadelphia Conference was really about this long war. It was not about the American Revolution as it had been traditionally defined. Much of the scholarship, I got this idea when, where's David? When you were talking about the environmental issues. You could see that most of these things being driven by the environmental issues were actually related to this imperial fighting. And it is interesting. That is the driving force of change. And when you decenter the American Revolution and this notion of national liberation and all the idealism that's unleashed by it, it's very clear that that long war becomes the dominant thing in global history in the last 3 centuries. This orientation towards this long global war has fit what I think is a very much the spirit of professional historical writing in the early 21st century. There's no liberation, no tragedy, no triumph, just different forms of colonialism, empire building, violent oppression, and negotiation of subordination or domination. The collapse of all boundaries, of all norms, the inability to recognize or interpret legal and political and geographical institutions as settled is the hallmark of scholarship shaped by these wars. Much of the post-colonial and subaltern theory invoked in these studies fits a struggle between 2 colonial powers whose goals and views and behavior in reality had very little space between them from a modern perspective. And indeed, I would suggest to you this evening that theory is very much the servant of the historical reality created by that war rather than the other way around, which I think scholars often think of it as well, they've gone down in and imposed this modern notion. But in fact, I think what's happened is the war has conquered the theory. Indeed, these lines of scholarship that are predominated have now, though, I think, dead-ended as completely as scholarship about the Republican synthesis did in 1990 and 1991. In a sense, one could say that some of the same issues are in play. A failure of archival research to a degree, source problems, and a failure of theory. I would join with Woody and others in saying that if you add the word Atlantic or world or global or continental or race to a study, it does not make it any more interesting or comprehensible necessarily. And at this point, they have become cliches rather than offering insight or direction. One might summarize that the first great cycle of interdisciplinary history, which focused on the revolution between 1960 and 1990, that its failure resulted from it being captured by its theoretical apparatus, and this second great cycle was captured by a historical reality it could neither describe nor fully recognize for what it was. It's a very strange thing, but I think in both of these cycles there's been a kind of seizure because of those problems. So, having reached that conclusion, which might get me in a lot of trouble, so what are we to do? How are we to think about the field as a whole, and how are we to rethink the revolution now? It has often seemed to me, reading over the last 10 years, because I've been thinking about this since the time Mern and I spoke about it, that we have, by privileging novelty over mastery, which has been a strong impulse in the field since the 1960s, it's related to what Woody was talking about last night, which is this drive constantly to get the dissertation done, get this done for tenure, do this. We have a tendency, particularly as we've embraced these various theoretical approaches, to embrace novelty rather than mastery. Which is a very strong impulse, but that we have reached, because of that, a strange and growing impasse. We have examined the rituals and rites, parsed the idioms of politics in everyday language from different perspectives, studied the periods of press classes, created the public sphere, deconstructed the public sphere, exposed the brutality of slavery in the period and its inconsistency with the revolutionaries' professed values, challenged patriarchy, celebrated patriarchy, defined patriarchy, revealed the socially constructed character of race and gender roles, uncovered the original intent of the founders through close readings, celebrated the founding fathers as founders, derided them as reactionaries, queered them, studied their genetic material, linked the revolution to the transition to capitalism, unlinked it to the transition to capitalism, examined demographics and migration's role in the revolutionary generation. We've localized it, now continentalized it, globalized it, microed it, macroed it, littled it, and now bigged it, even questioning the idea of truth itself in the process, until it would rationally seem that theorists from sociology and anthropology and linguistics and interdisciplinary work itself have nothing new, or nothing new that is sane to offer us as historical tools to examine the revolutionary period. What are we to do? We are running out of oceans to call worlds, and may have to resort to calling seas and even lakes or little streams worlds. The muddy river world, the world of the Fenway, the world of the Green Line B trains, the world of the BU East Green Line train stop, which is outside my office. We have run out of borders and borderlands, repeatedly centralized those on the margins, focused on the obscure. We have stretched and pulled the chronological and geographical boundaries of early America and the American Revolution until they have disappeared. In short, we are exhausting categories and systems and geographies just as we have exhausted theory. while leaving our field bereft of debate over the central issue in our past, or indeed debate over any real issues, and our society lacking a kind of general, accessible, dynamic history of the American Revolution created by scholars. So what are we to do? Interdisciplinary history, the concept that has, in a sense, guided or bound the field, and to a significant degree, to a significant extent, the profession as a whole since the 1960s, and that has been used to legitimate these approaches in a general sense, has become nothing but a meaningless slogan in my view. Nothing more, a kind of totem. A week does not go by where some dean or vice provost for assessments and outcomes tells us via a memo or announcement that something is good because it's interdisciplinary, or breaks down disciplinary boundaries, which are apparently something akin to the Great Wall of China. The assault on them has been going on for the last 50 years. Apparently these boundaries just refuse to go down. Deans in our STEM-crazy 21st century university like the term because it allows them to claim to have an intellectual vision, and because it also allows them to make joint appointments in the humanities, effectively replacing 3 humanists in different departments with one who does what they self-select as interdisciplinary work. The term has become a moral judgment and a measure of quality, even as its analytical purpose and character has become obscured and lost all meaning. The underlying intellectual logic that appeared in the early 1960s has weakened and disappeared, although we have now, up to this point, failed to acknowledge it. Are we now, I think, to pursue another trend that ends with a dozen young scholars saying the same thing over and over, which has created what Woody Holton called a poverty of imagination in the field? Or are we to celebrate ourselves for making the 16th century Yucatan part of early America, and the age of revolutions a substitute for the American Revolution, to be taught to a globalized population, which seems to be the direction some scholars wish to go in? And are those of us who are interested in the revolution's political history and political culture and constitutional character to annually sacrifice a goat to Jack Rakoff and his friends, to thank them for solving all problems of interpretation in regard to the revolution? The honest truth is, no one really has an answer to this underlying general problem in this room. Usually at this point, in this type of talk, the speaker who's made these kind of judgments has a powerful new theoretical framework to introduce, or outlines a major new reinterpretation based on an exciting new book, or as is the fashion in this very moment, issues an exciting but poorly thought through historical manifesto available to open access online to be criticized. Sadly, I can't do any of these things, but I do have 3 or 4 observations about where we are. I think we are in this moment in a situation similar to the scholars that scholars found themselves in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and again through much less obviously or coherently found themselves in around 1990, when changes in technology, universities, and society enabled fundamental changes in the direction in the field itself. Clearly, the society has changed dramatically under the weight of technology, immigration, and internal migration over the last 25 years, and some of these changes are still intensifying. And equally clear, the university structure received from the 1960s is under sustained pressure for change, which has become really apparent over the last 5 years especially. There is a hostility towards traditional universities that does more than reflect, I think, just the traditional anti-intellectualism, common in American society, but is something new, I think. And within universities, there's hostility and disdain for the humanities, and I think it's growing still. And I think every person who teaches the humanities in this room knows this to some degree. The history departments have, under these pressures, I think, ironically, become more presentist. More focused on now, and in American history, more 20th century heavy, as many of you, again, who teach in universities at least know. At this point in the talk, I say, you should say more here. And in a sense, we do need to be aware, or aware at least of why studying the revolution, it cannot resolve those issues, but why it is an answer to them in a certain way, even though one that's bound, in a sense, to fail. There is an importance to that, but it would take too long and go off in too deep of a direction. But I do think when I was writing that, I was thinking, well, okay, what do you want to say about that? It does seem apparent to me that the lack of the teaching of the revolution certainly does nothing to blunt these changes. In our own field, I think, in the field of early American history, though, I do want to say that the advent of a new technology, which is placing the entire, more or less, corpus of material printed in the 17th and 18th century Anglo-American world, and ultimately the entire body in print everywhere in the English language in that period, which we're getting closer to, placing that online, accessible on any laptop, and digitalized with more and more manuscript images also being digitalized. And the online availability of all paintings, prints, and images from the period, it is changing the potential and will change the direction of scholarship, I think, in two ways. First, obviously, the number of people able, whether they actually do it or not is another issue, able to do real research in 18th century sources is again expanding, just as the advent of microfilm and fellowships expanded in the early 1960s. With the appropriate online access, scholars at smaller schools are removed from the Eastern archives and libraries, and for that matter, scholars in other fields and non-professional scholars are going to be able to study in early America with a kind of intensity that they have not been able to. You can be in Frozen Sneakers, Montana, or for that matter, in Sydney, Australia. Incidentally, that Sydney, Australia got during the snowstorm in February. I was online with Mike McDonald. Some of you know him, of course. He's a very fine scholar of the Revolution, and I said I was making progress on my book, which I'm working on, but the weather intruded. And he writes back with any sense of irony. He goes, yeah, I know. I was in the backyard. It's 85 degrees, and I felt like I should go surfing. I said, yeah, that's not exactly what I had in mind. You know, there's 9 feet of snow and an Alp in my backyard. I mean, but no sense of irony in that. But if you have an internet connection, you can be in Sydney, Australia, and you can do real research on the American Revolution or any other aspect of early America if you should be so inclined. And with the phone camera, you can visit and archive and photograph hundreds of pages in one day, manuscript pages, and then, of course, just blow them up. But I think perhaps more significant to our discussion is that the ability to search and data mine these massive printed databases and eventually the archival material placed online as well will restructure the very foundation of knowledge in our field. The word search article and dissertation have already begun to appear, but these are almost always crude efforts, these sort of data mine or word scrapers type of things. Most of them are bad ones. They pile up references, and they're often disembodied and decontextualized. These efforts and the other sort of similar primitive efforts, some with crowdsourcing editorial projects, I think these efforts mask the enormity of the change to come. The genealogy of terms and usages and concepts, the networks along which printed knowledge moves, the chronology of that movement, what we might call the quantification of language itself on a massive, unprecedented scale, and more sophisticated, I think, search engines that will allow for a more sophisticated kind of examination of this literature, its structure, which we haven't had yet. That is going to alter how we understand early America as a whole. It also, incidentally, as someone pointed out to me today, this kind of technological change is also going to alter how we understand something like kinship. When we get enough records online, we're going to be able to determine what the underlying kinship structure was in a host of institutional and community structures in early America on a scale that we have not been able to. And that's going to tell us more about the nature of family and how family relates to other changes in the society. The Revolutionary Era, with its thickness of publication and its broad variety of sources, its conflicts fought in print, and the previous era of scholars' focus on language structure and the intense parsing of constitutional terms and structures, combined with its massive importance to the general public, it seems to be the logical and powerful target of this kind of restructuring of these search engines and a sort of reconsideration. The search engines will allow us to look at things that we haven't looked at before. And almost certainly, if it becomes the subject of such an examination, a large part of the intellectual edifice created in the 1960 to 1990 period to explain politics, ideology, and practice in the Revolutionary Era will be altered, modified, discarded, or crumble in the process. I believe both our lack of focus on the revolution over the last 25 years and the kind of crude character of the search engines themselves, the architecture, the search architecture, that's inhibited this from happening. Because I thought this was going to start 10 years ago, and in a way it has, but you can see a much more massive transformation is coming. Eventually, as all this material is put online, particularly manuscript material, and a kind of common standard is established for its, the way it's put online, and you'll be able to not only word search and do all this other stuff, but be able to search through different types of sources and different types of source spaces. It's going to alter how we look at a lot of things. In saying this, I hope I will not be understood as arguing for digital humanities in the way way it has become now to be commonly used, it's just another meaningless term. There's no such thing as digital humanity. Seriously, it does not exist. In the fashion, people discuss it, just as its relationship to another inane term, digital historian. Instead of fixating on the tool, we need to fixate on the nature and the parameters of the problems of change we are trying to examine in the period. It is clear to suggest using technology in this manner is to say that the study of the revolution as it has traditionally been defined is not exhausted and that all its major interpretive problems are not resolved, especially if we stop worshiping the toolbox and begin that began to be assembled in 1960, or better yet, use the tools as they were intended to be used, not as ends unto themselves or for president's political agendas, but to examine change in the past. If there's a McConville manifesto in this talk, which Malik Gatt, where's Malik? Malik kept saying, what's the manifesto? What's the manifesto of your talk? In regard to politics, political ideology, institutions, and constitutionalism, my manifesto is none of the major interpretive problems are resolved. We do not need to just, example, find, as Woody said last night, I disagreed with Woody about this, let's look at the common people again. All the major problems are wide open to reconsideration, and much as what has been written about them in the past generation should be read archaeologically as evidence of its time, as much as it addresses the 18th century. For certain, it would seem that some questions, like those around the Constitution and constitutionalism, are so saturated it is impossible to say anything new about them. Impossible. I think everyone in this room would agree it could not be more insane. The volume of stuff produced on the founding and the original intent of the founders by scholars, not just in history, but in several disciplines, political philosophy, law, various other schools, some of them even in English professors working on. The founding, original intent, constitutionalism, that would I see, okay, that's exhausted as a historical subject. But even that, I think, is untrue in a broad sense. I want to suggest that the whole literature about the founding and the fundamental law reflects 20th century sensibilities of the left and the right about federal government and its relationship to the constitutionalism of the period. You can see how the demands of both the right and the left led to this beginning really in the progressive era with Beard, but intensified in the 1930s, and then continued on into this day because the federal government became more important. The Federalist Society, which the group of lawyers and legal thinkers on the right who have driven the idea of original intent, which reflects this. There's a good book about this, incidentally, about their role and how people think about this by a woman, it's brand new, by a woman named Amanda Hollis-Brusky. It's called Ideas with Consequences. In fact, that construction of the federal Constitution's legal historical nature, which they don't agree on, but they both fixate on, it's of course, it was one of the 20th century's great intellectual projects and great shifts. It is, of course, central to understanding that century, the 20th century. A key intellectual project of the 20th century was the conquest and colonization of the portion of the 18th century in which the Constitution was written. No, I'm quite serious. And the person who incidentally indicated this in my last conversation with her was Pauline Mayer, who was interested in how we got to the Bill of Rights. I disagreed with her about her specific point about the Bill of Rights being a construction of the 20th century, but I agree with her general point, that, in other words, much of what we think of as being in the Constitution in 1788, or part of it, or part of the political culture, was grafted on later. It seems to me that the key to understanding the constitutional side of how revolutionary America stabilizes itself and what was essential and critical about it, its search for constitutional order, is not to be found in this sort of close reading of the federal Constitution. It is to be found in the lack of fundamentality in the state constitutions, in one of the 60 plus, depending on how you count them, conventions. I think of the number around 65, but it depends because they would break up and then they would reconvene. But there were about 60, just between 60 and 65 state constitutional conventions that occurred between 1775 and 1830, and in the ability to convene and reconvene, and in the assumption of a lack of fundamentality itself, a different constitutionality is clearly being expressed, and it was the willingness and the sort of awareness that they could rip the state constitutions up and rewrite them that really did sort of shape their constitutionalism in that period. Of course, there's an element of this in the federal Constitution as well. We don't get into the federal Constitution, its sort of fixed identity as a fundamental and founding document until the 1820s. That's when it emerges. And again, Pauline Maier and I, we never agreed about anything until the end of her life. And then right before she became ill, she said, you're right about this, because she was already doing the same thing. So naturally, she since I agreed with her, she thought I was right. It allowed the society, though, and I do think that this is right, this malleability allowed the society to absorb both what we might call the revolutionary impulse, which is obviously a very nebulous term, and to adjust readily to the forces created by massive demographic changes. And that embrace of a lack of fundamentality expressed a different kind of constitutionalism than either the precedent-based, unwritten tradition inherited from the British Constitution or the kind of fundamental, originalist understanding that has become common in the latter half of the 20th century. I also think that there was a difference between this malleability in the state and the sort of notion about malleability that some of the federal founders had as well, but which I do think, again, that Pauline Maier was right about that they did not think it was fixed. In this same vein, one could also just as easily say that what emerges in 1788 and 89 is not a new, strong national government, but rather one centralizing republic and two small independent republics in New England, Rhode Island, and Vermont, whose ultimate integration in the U.S. is hardly a foregone conclusion. If you visit the Rhode Island Historical Society, you can see they start to say, well, we better set up toll booths and passport control, better find out. They want it to stay out. It really is a kind of, there's much more complexity to why these two countries, as they are, join the United States. It is hardly a foregone conclusion. In saying all this, I am not trying to say to argue that we should just write about the Constitution or anything like that. Rather, what I am saying is the period and many of its problems, especially its political problems, can be rewritten in a new and thoughtful way by freeing ourselves from the various received wisdoms constructed in the last 50 years, doing archival research, and thinking about that period as a time and a place. It is clear that archival engagement and a thoughtful new use of this new technology to this end will enable a change and allow us to rethink in a deliberate, original fashion the entire early American period, especially the politics of the Revolution. Putting aside received wisdom, especially wisdom that has been brilliantly written, which much of that literature was over the last 50 years, to put that down is ultimately more challenging and also more rewarding than we're invoking Habermas or any other of the token intellectual gods of the last 50 years. But to conclude, I do think to advocate re-examining the American Revolution and locating that re-examination as a central part of the field raises the issue of national history, of the value of a colonial America and the American Revolution with recognizable geographic and chronological boundaries, or at least markers, versus the history of colonialism and history of revolutions, which has become a major trend, I think, and the issues raised need to be discussed more openly, clearly, forcefully, and frankly. It's not that there is no awareness of this or discussion in the field, but it's clear these two trends, or there are trends that are in many ways at odds, if that's a right way to put it, and raise difficult and different kind of questions to ponder. I believe personally that good history can be written about a lot of things, but a real question remains, what do we do about our national history? Maybe the question is, what do we mean by early America? Is it a national history, an imperialized and extended version of early modern European imperial and dynastic history written large, a subaltern dominated field in which the other or others of the Western Hemisphere become the core and focus, or is it all of the above, or is it something else? Personally, I believe the answer is yes, we do have a national history, although we are under no obligation to portray it positively or negatively, or to take a moral position on its meaning, or to detach it completely from broader changes, or even to make politics its sole focus. In other words, I believe we can have a national history without it being dominated by overt nationalism. I think it's clear that this is, in the 18th century, most people think of themselves as parts of communities, as parts of religious groups, as part of polities, and ultimately as parts of empires or nations. Most of the people I've read in my 25 years in the business, that's how they think of themselves, not as global citizens or categories or pieces in networks per se. To make them that way, I think, puts thoughts in their heads and exposes them to many forms of presentism. The reality that the people of the 18th century thought of themselves in certain ways gives the use of national history a legitimacy, in my view, as a primary, although hardly exclusive, category of examination and analysis. I think many early Americanists who are studying what really are the Spanish Empire or the French Empire or the Russian Empire or the Comanche Empire and the subordinate peoples of those empires, they don't think of it that way. However you feel about this question, It is a discussion worth having, and indeed we need to have it at a reasonable level of sophistication. Obviously, it has broader cultural meaning, but for us, it should be an intellectual question about how and why we study change. We need to first discuss it as a technical problem before we have our all too predictable heart attack about having raised the issue at all. It may not fit the times in the academy or the society as a whole, or the themes of globalism or the methods adopted from anti-colonialism, but in my view, it won't be much of a society if we don't have an early history and become detached professionally, or as a society from that period, which has produced the values we now, I think knowingly or unknowingly, purport to measure everyone, everything, and every society against. And if we fail to re-engage our revolutionary history in a way at times that we have over the last 25 years, we cede its interpretation to popular writers, both good and bad, whose sensibilities about the period are different from ours and often lack an archival basis and tend to flatten out the age's ironies and paradoxes and tragedies and triumphs. Without that dialectical relationship between the national historical mythology and the professional scholarship, which ultimately seeks to tear at or revise those national myths, something essential is lost in our culture. It is so central to the society as a historical reality, as ideological wellspring of our values, and as part of this national mythology that the latter, of course, being something we academics often have a hard time acknowledging, and yet which is very real in our society, as uncomfortable as that sometimes makes us. By recentering its study in this moment, I think I only seek to accelerate what is already occurring, as the conference this weekend demonstrates. But I think that we should lead the creation of a new understanding of the American Revolution for new and very different generations of Americans, and indeed students of American history everywhere. Thank you. All right, you want to take the questions? You want me? Oh, I'll take them. Okay. Yes.
What do you mean by the American Revolution?
This is a good question. In other words, chronologically, we're talking about, or politics.
Let's start
Look, it's a political. I mean, I see it as a political.
And what are the dates?
Well, again, that's a good question. Periodization. And this is one of the things that we've fallen back on when we want to sort of say, well, okay, let's obscure this or let's fool around with it.
No.
But I'm saying, look, in other words, do we take it as a long-term shift, or do we
yeah.
take it as a tightly argued constitutional issue, in which we would take it as a constitutional issue? You would probably then begin in 1764 with the opening questioning of the structure of the British Constitution, and then take it out into the early 19th century, where you have a final sort of emergent stability in the Jeffersonian period to a certain degree. That depends.
It's not the traditional American Revolution.
No, I'm not. No, it's not the traditional American Revolution.
You want a revision of the revisiting of the traditional American Revolution?
Look, one could strongly argue that. Look, you give it a primer to 1788.
I don't know what you mean by a traditional American Revolution.
Oh, what would be the traditional? Look, by that I mean either beginning in 1763 or 1764 and ending with the constitutional crisis and ratification. That's a traditional boundaries.
It's a political history.
It's a political history, but of course.
Of white males.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think it's far more complex than that. I mean, it's not a history of white males, and even in politics, as you know, and even if we put aside, for example, in New Jersey where women can vote and these other issues, that what becomes political for people is far more complicated than that. I mean, look at for these.
That sounds very interdisciplinary. That sounds theoretical.
Well, no, it doesn't. It's not theoretical. To me, this is part of the problem that we get into, which is what problem of change am I looking at? And as each scholar.
Why?
What? No.
Why?
Right. That's exactly what I said. So we're in agreement. I said that at the end. Why were we doing? What problem were we looking at?
And what problem do you think we should look at?
Well, no, I'm not advocating for one problem
Give me
or another.
A question. What question would this revitalized study of the American Revolution answer that you feel the current scholarship isn't answering?
Well, I feel like none of it is. I mean, I feel like it all can be revised. But let's say in my own case, I would say, look, yes, can we revise the entire constitutional history of the American Revolution? My answer to that is yes, we can.
But
That's an issue for me. I'm saying, but I'm not saying that we should do what I do. That would get kind of boring if we all do what I do. If we were all like me, it wouldn't be much of a field. I mean, it would get crazy quick. I don't think that's it.
Because I thought you just said there's nothing new to be said about the Constitution.
No. I just said quite the opposite. I said there's a lot to be new to be said.
I mean, I just think posing the issue like this, I love it because it's provocative, and I love the challenge to force us to think about the importance of the revolution. But, whose revolution is it and for what? And, you know, it would be a tragedy to just go back to some
No,
other.
no. All I'm suggesting is I don't see it as a tool of it's my revolution or it's somebody's revolution. I'm saying it has to be problem oriented. Let's look at it as a problem. Problem of change. What problem of change
It's
are we looking
always
at?
somebody's revolution. Is it the elite white males? Is it the bottom up? Is it the top down? Is it the artisans? Is it the women? I mean, it's always, if nothing else, didn't we learn that from this 25 years of dearth of scholarship? It's
I just don't-
somebody's revolution.
Look, I don't see it that way. I do think that that maybe it's just an issue of perspective. But I honestly
You don't think that you're reading documents written by certain people with certain
Oh no, of
assumptions?
course.
and-
To what? All I'm saying is, if we have a problem, we're working on all books, all articles should be problem driven. What is the problem of change I'm looking at?
And what is the problem?
Oh, I'm saying, look, I'm not specifying one problem. I'm saying let's examine the error as a whole. I mean, it's not,
For
you know,
what
but I do
purpose?
think, but to what purpose? Because I think that the existing body of scholarship can be revised. It's not to achieve something politically, or not to elevate one group over another. I don't have those ends. Nothing that happens, you know, in terms of that kind of contemporary.
You do have ends, though. You think.
Yeah, of course, but they're scholarly. It's to examine why do I think change happened in that period. They're not to elevate one, you know, partisan or one group over another. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I agree. You concluded on the issue of national mythology and our professional obligation as historians. You put them over against each other. Isn't part of the problem that those popularizers and their political disposition have tried to supplant the discourse that professional historians do? What I'm trying to get at is, don't we also have an obligation to engage in and critically comment on that national mythology?
Oh no, that's what I said at the end of the talk.
Yeah, so could you spin that out a bit?
Yeah, look, we've already been defeated. That's already over. The popular writers control the, and one could, if depending on how harsh you want to be, you could describe the ideology of that as neo-romantic nationalism. Look, that absolutely, but that battle's already over. We've been defeated.
We don't re-engage.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We have to re-engage it. I mean, but look, that part of it. This said, I do think that scholars have a hard time, often when you talk to people, understanding that mythology is crucial to the society. The society cannot function appropriately without it. And that scholars have a tendency to hold it in contempt, and the people who propagate it in contempt. And that's not exactly how a society functions. Yeah. Lige.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to Hopkins, Jack Green student who's never written about it.
This was the gentle treatment. Right? I'm working on the big one on that. Yeah.
A revolution.
Right. Right. No. That's changed.
No,
Also.
what's that? No.
That's changed where his focus has been. I think that's changed.
Well, but I mean, you and I, we've got the same trajectory. I started in '92, and,
Right.
So you know, but you know. As Brendan knows, on the steering committee, I pitched a paper, the call for papers, that I thought might make a good plenary talk. I'm glad you gave the talk, because Paradise Lost is more interesting than Paradise Regained. But I would actually take the trend that you so eloquently described and say that's actually been a really good thing, the globalization of the revolution. I think the question about how these 13 colonies fit into an international system, what the international consequences of that are, what the consequences for those colonies of that attempt is profound. And I think I would argue that in the last...
You've just written a book about it. That's why you think it's profound. I mean, you know,
there's a whole group, and I think that is where some of the most fruitful and important work has been in the last 10 years. I'm not just thinking about...
That's a strain in the scholarship. I agree with you. That's a strain in the scholarship there.
And I think in this global moment, just as the Cold War shaped the scholarship of the 60s and 70s and 80s, so too, the global moment we're in, a moment of endless war, I think it behooves us to think about how we imagine the place of the United States within that historically. You know, John Kerry just declared the
That's
end
another
of
one
the
of Jack's students over there.
John Kerry just declared the death of the Monroe Doctrine last November. We should be analyzing what that means. It's actually interesting. I don't think there's anybody, I'll wait for tomorrow, I'm still finishing some of the papers, talking about the Spanish dimensions of the American Revolution. They're hugely important.
Well,
And-
look, what you're arguing is that you're arguing for what you're arguing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, they're Kathleen Duvall's new book. It's certainly an among
Right,
the
but
powers.
what you're
It's there.
basically arguing is a thing that I mentioned here, which is that most of that is really about the war between France and Britain and the things that
not
are in
at
orbit
all.
and not.
Not at all.
Having read your book, I would say yes, that's what it's about. I mean, yeah,
Not
I do.
at all. Not at all.
That's-
the question is, how do you democratize a nation or a confederation of nations or states in this era of tremendous international stress? What does it mean when you move from war to peace?
That's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are big questions.
Alan.
Brendan, I think, look, I've spent the last 18 years fighting administrative wars as chairs of two important departments in public institutions, as dean in another one. And what's important is less what we tell than how we tell the story. Because without our ability to put students in the seats, without our ability to speak with the humane voice of the humanities, without our ability to say that, to articulate these different kinds of issues in a clear manner, we lose all our ability to be the varied kind of historians that we are, because we have to have this constituency out there, it seems
Look,
to me. And that's what I kind of missed from your talk, to be honest. You raised all these kinds of problems and so on.
But what I mean, how do you get people there? Is in other words.
Well, yeah, and that's why I come back to the point is it's the language in which we tell these. Can we tell these stories in an engaging kind of way?
Look, what you're saying, I agree with in terms of presentation, but there is an issue. You're right in the sense that traditionalist approaches to things have tended to come. As most of us know in this room, enrollments in your average history course have dropped dramatically. And there's a failure. And look, I mean, you can teach courses either on themes. It's how you tell what you want to tell. I agree with that to a certain degree. I don't disagree with you there, Alan. I think we're on the same page.
I don't think you do. But all I'm trying to do is underline that. That's all.
No, definitely, it's true.
And nothing more than that. And I think it plays into your comments about technology, the changes, and so on. Somehow we have to tell the stories with clarity in this new kind of environment.
I agree.
And I think that's really crucial. Otherwise, we can argue ourselves sick about what kind of presuppositions we bring to this, what kinds of jargon we use or whatever. But we have to have an audience, and that's really important.
Go ahead, Dick. I know you had your hand up. Yeah.
I got a couple of thoughts, and one is raised by Alan's remark just now, which I think, while it has merit, I really don't think it's anything like the whole story, because I don't think a charm offensive will do it, and I don't think we're less charming than whereas the generation previous and previous to that and so on. I mean,
Well, speak for yourself, Dick. I mean,
well, I am speaking for myself. Who else would I speak for? But I mean, I think in Elijah's remarks and in some of yours, you both pointed to the fact that whatever historians may think they're doing, they're writing about their own time. They're understanding the past within the framework of assumptions with which they live. And the questions that are important to them are the ones that arise out of their experience. And that's why some of the questions that you find tiresome arose, because they arose out of the experience of
Absolutely.
a variety of people over the past 25 years. Now, for me, this is a reason for optimism. Why is that? Well, I think in some ways we're at a time of certain paradigm shifts in terms of American aspiration and ideals. I think the problem of inequality in the United States is coming to be recognized in a way that it hadn't been recognized for a generation. I think the situation of the United States and the world, similarly, is being rethought in ways that it was not when we had the triumphal end of the Soviet Empire. I think the issues of ethnicity and race in the United States are at least as complex and interesting now as they ever have been.
I agree
and
with that.
for all of these reasons, I think the American Revolution, which is, however you date it, the American Revolution is a time when all of these questions
Are in play
were absolutely in play and which
in a
Americans
fundamental way.
were trying to figure out how to do it. And the solutions that they came up with were faulty, but they were efforts, and I think we can learn from those efforts, and I think we will find those efforts illuminating for our own time and the ways that we address questions in our own time.
I agree, and I think since that was so well put, I think we should end on that because Conrad wants. Do you want to end?
I was just going to say that it's no surprise that Brendan has the words flowing. Unfortunately, we've got another day's worth of conference, so there's an opportunity tomorrow to play out these various themes.
Right.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.